And Mitra Kashani is a biology student and a master's student at George Mason University. She's working on her thesis studying environmental health impacts of hydraulic fracturing and wastewater spills. She's actively involved in the environmental and climate justice movement with several youth-led organizations. She founded a chapter of the Virginia Student Environmental Coalition at Mason 2 years ago, has served as a youth delegate to the World Bank spring meetings, Sustain Us to push for clean climate finance, and has been involved with Sunrise Movement for over a year. So please welcome Wendy Gao and Mitra Kashani to speak on their local work.
Hello, everyone. So glad to see everyone's faces here. My name is Mitra, as Kelsey introduced me. I go to George Mason University. I'm 22 years old. I'm a biology student, and I'm living in Loudoun County, Virginia, so pretty local to this area. And in honor of this being a Mother's Day climate rally, I wanted to pay a little homage to my own mom, who couldn't be here today, but I promised her I would read this speech to her when I go home. Given a little background, my mom was born and raised in a little country in the Middle East called Iran. You might have heard of it. And when I was growing up, she would always tell my brother and I stories about the landscape of her home country. So where lush, verdant meadows, towering mountain ranges, great salt lakes, and mystifying deserts coexisted. And they could tell the story of this ancient civilization that was passed down generation after generation to my brother and I. And this land I have never set foot in, not once in my life, but I still feel like I've lived there all my life through her stories. I myself was born in Vancouver, Canada. It's a little louder. Woo! Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. Right next to the Pacific coast, right next to the water. And as a young girl, my mother would take me to the beach when I was growing up, and 5-year-old dreams would come true in tidal pools. And the silhouette of old-growth forests and archaic glaciers and mountains were always in my backyard. And then for the last decade and a half of my life, I've grown up here in Northern Virginia, so quite a change of scenery from the Pacific Northwest, but still, interestingly enough, it was here in Northern Virginia that I learned, that my mother taught me actually, of the power the earth has to heal us. So as an anxious teenager, I'm sure as many of us were, my mom would force me to go outside with her on intentional nature walks where I would cleanse my soul, and we would walk side by side in nature and let it soften us and calm our fears and our worries and our stress as a respite from the rest of the world. So now that world that my mother was showing me growing up is constantly changing, right? In Iran, prolonged drought and desertification due to rising temperatures and mismanagement of watersheds has left many of our watersheds almost bone dry. In British Columbia, rising sea levels and melting ice caps threaten heavily populated coastal communities. And to top it off, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, set to carry up to 800,000 barrels of crude oil per day, still beckons at the door of our province. And it's threatening our clean air, clean water, and the sovereignty and rights of indigenous communities that live there, that pipeline would drill through their land. And then in Virginia, in our shared home here today, our forests, our streams, our watersheds, the precious wildlife, especially in Southwest Virginia, are being threatened by deforestation, by clear cutting, as oil and gas money continues to buy out our politicians and decision makers, where together they can bypass permitting systems to construct these destructive and unnecessary fossil fuel infrastructure through our earth. So, as you can tell, environmental misconduct and climate change are not mutually exclusive, and they are not isolated phenomena either. No country, state, city, or person or community is going to be immune to the effects of a changing climate. And this is all going to hold true if we continue on the trajectory that we are on today. Now, I say we as if you and me and everyday people have caused this problem that we're in today, but I want to change that conversation. So many of our representatives, as we know, and politicians, yes, those very same ones that are supposed to represent us and our best interests, which include the right to a livable future, to clean air and clean water, have neglected to recognize the scale of the climate crisis. The science has been in for decades, we know this. The debate has been over for almost decades, and we are currently in a state of climate emergency. So we know that a changing climate will continue to perpetuate uncertainty, inequality, and stress. It is a force multiplier, particularly for vulnerable communities, communities of color, low-income communities, and those that live on the front lines of toxic industries. And future generations, including my own and those that will come after me, we have collectively been seen as collateral in the exploitative malfeasance of the fossil fuel industry and elected officials whose bottom line is continuously replenished by big oil and gas, unabated and unchecked. But I have a feeling that that's about to change, and I have a feeling when I look at this crowd today. So, as Butch mentioned, I think today climate change is already the top issue for the Democratic primary voters going into the 2020 elections. I think we did that. In Virginia, legal challenges continue to stifle Dominion Energy's construction of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, while tree sits, blockades, and people-powered grassroots organizing continues to slow work on the Mountain Valley Pipeline too. And again, we did that. As the Virginia state legislature elections are coming up, we have to go all in to make sure that we kick Dominion Energy and its buddies to the curb and keep fossil fuel finance out of our elections. So, on that same breath, we need to be working with the policymakers and representatives that are representing us, like Delegate Guzman, who I'm not sure is here today, but also Sam Rasool, and others, and to push hard and relentlessly for a Green New Deal in Virginia, whether that includes upscaling renewable energy, technology, retrofitting buildings and universities to be more energy efficient, or transforming our agricultural sector to one that is sustainable not only for the land and the water and the air, but for the farmers who depend on them. And on that same breath, I want to talk about a just transition to renewable energy. So what do I mean by a just transition? Well, first, I always like to think about the millions of workers that are in the fossil fuel industry right now that will have to transition out of that workplace into this Green New Deal future. I think about the communities of color, the low-income communities, and the indigenous communities who are impacted by polluting industries, by land grabs, by climate disasters first and worst. And in order to build a relationship with a regenerative economy and a renewable energy economy after decades of living through an extractive one, the power has to shift to the people. It has to shift to us here today, where workers and communities have the autonomy to make decisions that impact their lives rather than being ignored and neglected as they have in the past. So reaching net zero emissions in the next decade is ambitious, I know, and I admit it sounds like a long shot. But today it's the best chance we've got, and we have to try and try together. Thank you.